You get us started. We haven't started yet, Gwen, in case it's not clear. We had tech issues, so we're about to get started.
All right, so this morning, the first two items you have are actually special appropriations for rental and assistance with homeless services that are Cdbg funding. The first one came via the state. You may remember that the council had a public hearing a few weeks ago when the county made an application to the state for Cdbg funding for rental assistance. And that one is the $3.4 million. And then the county has also directly received $4.2 million. Again, this is in Cdbg funding, and it can be used for rental assistance or for services for the homeless shelter system, I should say. And so these have been introduced, and you are scheduled to take action on them at council tomorrow, but we wanted to have a committee recommendation. So they are before you today, and it gives you a chance to hear from Director Nagam and Mr. Demaray about some of the issues with rental assistance. And I also wanted them to just briefly give you an update. There is another state program where landlords apply directly to the state on behalf of their tenants for assistance. And that's one that kind of falls outside of the rent assistance that you normally get updates on. So I thought it would be an opportunity to talk about that as well. And with that, I'd let Director Nagam make any comments that he'd like to make.
Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone had a good Thanksgiving. It's good to be back in action now. So just quickly on these two programs, first $3.4 million of Cdbg assistance for rental assistance coming from the state. As you remember, about 2 months ago, we applied to the state for a competitive grant application process, and we were successful in getting an award of about $3.4 million, which will be used for rental assistance. These are Cdbg funds, so we have to follow Cdbg regulations. The tenants have to be Cdbg income eligible, and they have to demonstrate COVID-19 related laws and also show their income, eligibility in terms of income certification. And this is true for $4.2 million too for the federal money, which is coming to the county as an entitlement community. With that said, with the $3.4 million of Cdbg funds, the state has, and within their criteria, they require us to request at least 50% of the funds within the first 9 months or so, and with the deadline of December 31st, 2021. With $4.2 million, we have a deadline of 6 years. Of course, we are not going to wait for 6 years. We want the rental assistance to be with the tenants sooner than later. But we'll start with $3.4 million first, and both the monies will be administered by HHS. At this point, we are working with our service providers, whether it's HEP, LEDC, CASA, Renters Alliance, and nonprofits to engage tenants and the landlords, and we need tenants and landlords cooperation alike over here. The landlords have to, at least in the state program, the landlords have to agree not to evict the tenant for the number of months assistance they receive. So in your resolution for $3.4 million, it says assistance of up to 6 months, which is typically allowed under Cdbg regulations. That being said, the state has also clarified for us, if we go up to 6 months of rental assistance, then we have to do unit inspections. So at this point, if we go through unit inspection, that will delay our process. And also during this pandemic, we are not doing unit inspections. So the other way to do this is to go up to 3 months of assistance. Then we do not have to do unit inspection. So at this point, we are planning to go up to 3 months of rental assistance, both for $3.4 million and for $4.2 million, 3 months is the maximum that HUD will allow anyway. So then in order to have uniformity in both the programs, we'll go up to 3 months of rental assistance and work with HHS, with our nonprofits and legal aid alike to get this money out. Now, in terms of just projecting now what relief we may be looking for from the federal government, a few days ago, we did have a conversation with Maryland congressional staff membership. And besides making a request for additional assistance for rental assistance or tenant counseling or legal aid, we also made a request to basically give us some more flexibility from the Cdbg regulations. So like the home program where the tenant can self-certify their income, they can self-certify COVID-19 related loss. We would like Congress to give us the same flexibility on the Cdbg side as well. That being said, the good news is at least as of January 1st, we'll have these two parts of money available for rental assistance. So once HHS disperses $20 million of rental assistance from the CARES Act by December 30th, we'll have these monies going in the new year. So as your $4.2 million resolution says, shelter use or the rental assistance, at this point, we intend to use $4.2 million for rental assistance as well. So that's our planning at this point. The second part that Linda was mentioning was about the state assisted program. The state came up with a $10 million assistance program for those properties where the state has made a loan. So some of our developers did use that program to get assistance where they could apply on behalf of the tenants and the payment were made to the landlords. Recently, we learned that the state has made another $10 million available out of the CARES Act, and these monies need to be spent by December 30th. So again, they have still opened up the program only for those properties where the state has made a loan. So we may have made a request to, like, we sent a letter to Secretary Holt in October. We sent an email, the request again to state, asking them to be flexible in their program, and if they can open up the program to also to those properties where the state may not have made a loan, but the county may have made a loan. Because what we are hearing from our developers is they have other properties in the county where they do not have state financing per se, but they have county financing. And since all tenants are equal, we are asking the state to see if they can give us some flexibility and open up, not just for Montgomery County, it would be statewide program, open it up for the entire state for those properties where the state has made a loan or has provided some kind of assistance as pilot or some other type of assistance per se. So we have not heard back from the state yet, but that's where we are. So hopefully, the state will look at our request favorably since they want to spend the money also by December 30th. So hopefully we'll have different parts of money available to the tenants, although the assistance will ultimately go to the landlord, but the tenant has to apply for these assistance. So that's where we are. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Do you think that a large share of the applicants will be in the nonprofit housing communities, or what's
that's my guess is that, you know, most of our nonprofit developers, well, our for-profit developers could apply too if they have state financing. So they're being indifferent whether, you know, it's a nonprofit developer or a for-profit developer. So, but we have circled back with our developer community, so they do see a need because, you know, they have several properties in the county where only the county has provided financing, but they do not have state loans. So we are trying, we'll keep on pushing on our end. If we can open up the doors for our developer community for other financing sources where they can get assistance on the rental side.
Okay, great. Any other presentation components? All right, any questions from colleagues? Okay. Linda, does that cover both appropriations? Yeah.
I think if you want to approve both at once, you can. So that's good.
I think we should. The second appropriation, I think, focuses more on the homelessness services, right? Linda, you said, but this is not the grant program, the $5,000 kind of exit.
No. So these are both Cdbg funding, which is different from the CARES funding, which is where the $5,000 pilot program is coming from.
Right.
The $4.2 million can be used for rental assistance or for emergency homeless shelter. So Director Nagam has indicated right now their intent is to look at rental assistance first, but I would just say it is also available, and there is time, since neither of these have the December 30 deadline. There is time to consider how to use the $4.2 million between the two programs.
Got it. Okay. Well, thank you. We have these two appropriations without objection. Will be approved and recommended by the committee.
Thank
you. All right. Thank you, DHCA. Nice to see everyone. All right. We'll move on to our next item, which is a briefing on the preservation study.
So this is a briefing for the committee on the housing preservation study. You have many people on the Zoom today for this. So the presentation will be led by the consultants. And so you have Mary Jiang from HRNA, Philip Cash, Arjun Sarma from HRNA, Brian Price from LSA Planning, and also Michael Spots from Neighborhood Fundamental LLC. From Park and Planning, Lisa Gavoni, of course, is on the call, along with Casey Anderson and Gwen Wright. And also Jason Sartori is on, and I believe Carolyn McCarthy is on, and Tanya Stern is on as well. And then Director Nagam and Deputy Director Demaray are staying on for this as well. There is a slide presentation to start with, and Lisa, I believe you are enabled to move the slides forward, although I believe the consultants will be presenting, if that's correct.
Great.
Morning,
Right.
Director Wright will give a brief introduction, and then I will, and then we'll segue into the consultant.
Good. Thank you. Director Wright, welcome.
Glad to be here. This is a really important study. I'm glad we're getting a chance to share it with you.
Okay. Lisa?
Good morning. For the record, my name is Lisa Gavoni with the Planning Department, and I'm pleased to be here today to bring the PHED Committee a briefing on the Preservation of Affordable Housing Study. Some background: the preservation study really came about after going through several master plans where we really struggled with the topic of preservation. I don't think that's anything surprising to anyone here. There always seems to be this underlying tension between wanting to preserve these existing facilities that we see as community resources due to their natural affordability, but there's also this understanding that there are market forces at play, and there's often no protection from the market, from market influxes and rents for these units. And we also have a huge infrastructure project like the Purple Line that is coming and may impact a lot of these facilities. In the past, we've also focused on preservation losses mostly in the context of redevelopment, but we know from looking at similar work done regionally and nationally that the most common preservation loss is not redevelopment. It's actually when market conditions change, when the market gets a little bit hotter, when an infrastructure project comes in and the rents go up and these units are no longer affordable. So the study really tackles the issue of preservation comprehensively under this broader definition of preservation that looks at risk factors for redevelopment pressures, but also market pressures, and also preservation as it relates to deed restricted units like MPDUs or tax credits. Fundamentally, I think the one thing that the study highlights is the need to balance both production and preservation, and that we really need both to have a sustainable housing market in Montgomery County that is diverse in unit type, size, and affordability. And so with that, I will turn it over to the consultant team of HRNA, LSA Planning, and Neighborhood Fundamentals to walk through the presentation.
Terrific. Well framed. Thank you. And we did review this, I think, over the summer in its draft form, and I'm glad to be here to look through it now that it's final.
Great. Lisa, thank you for the introduction. I'm Phil Cash, and I'm a partner at HRNA. As was laid out, there are several consultant teams on the team, so we're going to go through the presentation today and give a chance for each team who present on their portion of work. So we have HRNA advisors, where I belong to, Ryan from LSA, Mike from Neighborhood Fundamentals, and Arjun and Mary also from HRNA advisors. We chose to pursue this project together jointly because we thought our skills were quite complementary, and we're also frankly excited that Montgomery County was choosing to look at this question as Lisa was laying out, preservation is always the fundamental issue in affordable housing because it's where most of your affordable housing stock is. Unfortunately, in most places, it tends to get overlooked with the focus on production. Production is critical, but without preservation, you tend to not make much progress. So we weren't surprised that Montgomery County, which tends to be pretty forward-thinking on affordable housing, was choosing to do this study, but we were glad to get a chance to frankly look at this question because it's not a question we get to look at in every community. We also appreciate that, frankly, you all have better data on the rents and conditions of your property. So I know that larger policy questions, things get overlooked, but as technocrats who doing the analysis for you, we can't emphasize enough how important and valuable that is that you have that data on what the rent conditions are on almost all of your properties. It makes our analysis much easier to do and frankly more accurate. Next slide. So we were charged to really look at 6 questions that we're getting at understanding the housing landscape. So what's happening overall? What are the macro forces? What's driving here? Then breaking out what are the preservation issues really for your deed restricted and your naturally occurring affordable housing. And when we say naturally occurring affordable housing, we're really talking about housing that's currently affordable that is exposed to the market. So there's no deed restriction on the property. There's nothing that means that affordability can't just go away as rents increase or the property is redeveloped. And then we started to look at a preservation framework. What are the tools available to the county and what are the trade-offs that come with those tools to actually support preservation of affordable housing, because it is a huge resource for the county and the residents of the county. Next slide. So as we started to look at the affordability stock, first cutting it at properties that are affordable at under 80% AMI, the majority of your rental housing is affordable under 80% AMI, and the vast majority of that affordable rental housing is unrestricted. But when you start to look at deeper levels of affordability, particularly under 30% AMI, the deed restricted units pay a much larger portion, also in the 30 to 60%. So yes, unrestricted is a huge part of it, but your deepest levels of affordability, your deed restricted units are also playing a very important role and really serving areas of deeper affordability on average. Next slide. So shifting focus a little bit to focus on the multifamily portion of your rental stock. We started to break that up into a couple different pieces, and as we go through this analysis, we're going to talk about these different chunks of your multifamily stock, and multifamily being 5 or more units in this case. There's about 100,000 units total. A little over half of those are priced over 65% AMI. So we put those are market rate. We put those in a separate category. Those that are priced, a multifamily that are priced under 65% of area median income, you have a closer to an even split between what's deed restricted and naturally occurring. You have more in the naturally occurring space, but you have, it's much, when we look at this overall, it's much closer to an even split. We split this up really so we understand, because the tools that are available and effective at a multifamily level are very different than the tools that are available on a single family level. And frankly, the tools that are applicable for deed restricted versus naturally occurring are changes. So we wanted to understand the trends are both different for these groups and what's driving the challenges to affordability. So understanding how different forces are changing or threatening affordability or supporting affordability, and which tools can actually address it. So we split along these lines to this. Next slide, please. I'm going to hand this over to Ryan at LSA, and he's going to talk a little bit more about the deed restricted inventory and where those properties are at and some of the forces that are impacting them. Ryan?
Thanks, Philip. For the record, this is Ryan with LSA Planning. I'm going to give a quick snapshot of some of the key characteristics of the deed restricted rental inventory in the county today, and briefly touch on the series of risk criteria that our team applied to the inventory to assess the level of loss risk. Then we're going to walk through some of the trend estimates of unit gains and as well as losses in recent years. And then lastly, talk about which deed restricted properties were determined to have the most risk of being lost based on the analysis performed. So you can see here overall, there's about 18,000 or so deed restricted rental housing units in the county. About a third of these units are located inside of the Beltway, primarily in Silver Spring and Tacoma Park. And then more than a third are along the I-270 and 355 corridors. And most of these units are in Gaithersburg and Rockville. Next slide, please. So we applied a series of 5 risk criteria to the entire deed restricted inventory. And these criteria range from, as you can see here, timing of the subsidy expirations on the properties, to the ownership and age of the buildings, and also location criteria as it relates to transit infrastructure and local price and income trends in the surrounding community. And again, the idea really is to hone in on which properties have characteristics that make them a higher risk of being lost from the affordable stock. And so it's important to note that we focus this analysis on subsidy expirations that are occurring within the next 2 decades. And that represent about 40% of the total subsidized deed restricted inventory. Next slide. I wanted to touch on this one quickly. So one of the key criteria that we looked at was the location of the deed restricted units and their proximity to rail transit infrastructure. And, market pressures in terms of rent increases and in some cases redevelopment tend to be higher near the transit stations. And so what we found is about 2/3 or about 62% of the upcoming subsidy expirations that are set to occur in the next 2 decades are in buildings that are located within a mile of an existing or planned rail station. And you can see here on the map that there's a clustering of these at-risk units in metro stations inside of the Beltway, particularly Silver Spring and Bethesda, and also along the Purple Line corridor. Next slide. Now, from the perspective of recent trends, the good news is that overall, deed restricted housing units are being built in the county faster than they're being lost. So you can see on this chart that since 2000, the net change, the estimated net change in units has been quite high, nearly 5,000 or so net new units in the past 20 years of deed restricted rental housing. It's important to note, however, that most of the units that have been lost are Section 8 units that are within kind of larger market rate sites. And then most of the units that have been built, the new units, are MPDUs. And so this distinction is important because while the net change overall is positive, the affordability level of what is being lost and what is being built is in many cases quite different. Next slide. So by applying the risk criteria that we touched on earlier to the inventory, we identified 9 specific properties that have a higher risk of being lost when the subsidies expire in the next 20 years. And that's not to say that other properties are not at risk, but these appear to have the highest level of risk based on the characteristics of the sites. So within these 9 properties, there's about 1,000 units or so, units that are affordable in the 40% to 60% AMI range, and 400 units or so that are at or below 30% AMI. All of these sites are owned by for-profit companies and are in neighborhoods where rents are trending up. And then most of the properties are near rail transit and are more than 30 years old. All incomes in and around these communities, as you can see in the far column, are typically rising, most of them. And then it's important to note that most of the highest risk sites in this list are located in and around downtown Silver Spring.
Okay, but Ryan, you said that these are deed restricted units, but they're privately owned?
Yes.
So they were built
privately owned.
They were built as, low-income housing tax credit.
Yeah, in terms of volume, most of the subsidized inventory is LIHTC, were LIHTC projects.
Okay.
Next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Arjun from the HRNA team.
Thanks, Ryan. Good morning, everyone. My name is Arjun Sarma from HRNA. I'm going to walk through our analysis of the NOAA inventory, kind of going through the stock characteristics, areas of potential risk, and key trends moving forward. So our definition for NOAA, again, is those units currently affordable below 65% of AMI. And so just to start with a few key takeaways, most of this housing stock is quite old. 78% was built before 1990. Most of them really were built between the 60s and the 80s. We did some loss projections, and of the 26,000 odd units, between 7,500 to 11,000 are projected to be lost within the next decade, between 2020 and 2030. And we're going to kind of talk about which of those units are more likely to be at loss in a little bit. The largest stock of NOAA is in smaller buildings, so those buildings with fewer than 20 units. This is quite common, but makes the kind of work of preservation a little trickier, because there's varied owners, different kinds of ownership structures, and it's a lot more decentralized than your large 200, 300 unit buildings. In terms of location, NOAA largely lies on the east side of 270 and outside the Beltway, consistent with areas that have seen less growth and high income demand. This is not to say that this type of housing stock doesn't exist everywhere, but the ones that are inside of the Beltway have rapidly been lost kind of already. Property ownership transfers, unsurprisingly, correlate closely with rent shifts and loss in NOAA. So between 2010 and 2019, NOAA properties made up over half of property transfers of non-deed restricted buildings. So these units, the buildings are being bought and sold largely by, for-profit private equity, real estate private equity, with an eye towards, potentially flipping or not, even without renovating or doing any rehab, getting those rents up as market pressures demand it. And proximity to transit is a strong signal for loss in units under 1250. And we're going to see this especially for stations kind of inside the Beltway. Next slide, please. So there's, this is going into a little bit of the framework, but there's really 4 ways in which a housing unit can be lost from the affordable stock. And we really, have been talking about the erosion of affordability, but just want to go through 4 of them in a little bit of detail. So the first obviously is physical deterioration. We talked about these units being old, as they age, there's insufficient investment, there might be to maintain habitability, that properties eventually removed from the housing stock. There's obviously the erosion of affordability via rent increase. So the rents just keep going up and it can no longer be considered affordable, despite no changes to the property, building, or business model. There's kind of value add investment. So there's market demand for this kind of middle and high income rental property. There's either NOAA or expiring deed restricted properties, and what there's, slight repositioning, there's some, refinishing, and they're either being positioned in the rental market kind of not at the very top, but again towards the top, or are being sold for, or being converted to for sale condos. And then of course there's redevelopment, they're completely being redeveloped, there's demo, there's new construction, and most of these properties are being put back at the top of the market. Next slide, please. So our charge was really, okay, there's this NOAA stock, we know it's being lost, what are the indicators and what are the factors of buildings that can give us clues to what is most at risk of being lost, of the NOAA being lost. So we really looked at 7 kind of factors, and we're going to go through all 7 of these, but really we looked at building age, we've looked at building size, and those kind of we think of together as kind of those typologies. And we found that older units built being the 60s and 70s have the greatest risk of redevelopment and increase in prices, but there's kind of like a middling relationship there. For building size, small buildings, as we talked about, are more likely to be affordable, but are losing affordability rapidly, as these 5 to 9 unit buildings that were previously kind of more decentralized are being sold to larger investors. Larger properties that are affordable, so those 200, 300 unit properties, are most likely to be deed restricted with the LIHTC and the things Ryan talked about. Proximity to transit really is the key indicator, and we put new infrastructure here as well, but it really is new transit infrastructure. It's the strongest indicator for increase in assessment land values and rents. Although kind of jurisdictional zoning and how much you're allowing near that transit, depending on different cities, remain confounding variables. So there isn't like a perfect relationship, but this is what we saw as the strongest indicator. We looked at renovation as well after some feedback from staff, and although large capital investments in a property suggest an increase in future revenue, the data is a little bit muddy on like what the actual quantitative effect on those renovations are in Montgomery County. I think we'll need a little bit more longitudinal data, but I think intuitively it's easy to assume and to think that as renovation dollars come into a property, we'll see those rents go up as investors expect that return. Property transfers are kind of a lagging indicator of NOAA risk. And so investors are a little bit more risk averse in this case. When they see those increasing rents and when they see those rates of increase coming, that's when more transfer activity occurs. And there's less transfer activity kind of as a leading indicator, which obviously would be more useful. And in terms of figuring out what the risk is. And in terms of owner type, consistent with findings around building size, larger property owners with 10 plus units tend to own properties most at risk of loss. So proximity to transfer, and just to go through this quickly, again, is a strong signal for loss in units. You can kind of see the blue here with the increase in 1250 units under 1250, and the red is a decrease in affordable units. And you can see that for stations inside the Beltway, especially, and as the call out shows near Bethesda, Silver Spring, Tacoma Park, you're losing those units quite quickly. Next, please. Roughly 2,300, or 8% of all units and 2% of the total housing stock is at risk, and within 1 mile of transit. So this is, not necessarily the largest share of units of your NOAA stock, but it really is important because they have the greatest access to transit, and these are really at the greatest risk of loss. Next slide, please. So again, areas along the planned purple line have already demonstrated a rapid decrease of low rent units, so a decrease in NOAA in the past decade. And the loss of these low rental units have been most rapid around the Bethesda metro station. So you can see that in terms of both, first, a little bit of speculation and generally rents going up, there's been significant loss of NOAA kind of through that purple line corridor there.
Which is also the inner ring. I mean, that's the,
right, fair.
It's inside the Beltway.
Yep, yes. Looking at the other factors, just really quickly. So over half of the units in buildings with fewer than 50 units are affordable to households earning up to 65% AMI. You can kind of see that if we're looking at 5 to 9 unit buildings, 61% of them are NOAA. Almost half of the ones between 10 to 50 are. So this is really where most of that stock is. Next slide, please. And again, going back to the point about age, if we're looking at the blue are your NOAA units, you can see most of them, excuse me, if you look at pre-1950 to about 1980, about half of all of those units are NOAA. And as you go forward, that rapidly decreases.
Your new housing stock, I'm sure, I'm gonna let you finish before we have a lot of discussion, but it's always worth pointing out that new housing is typically built to the market and old housing is much more affordable. So it's very popular to rage against luxury housing. A lot of that housing inside the Beltway was built as quote unquote luxury housing. I've seen the advertisements for some of those really tall buildings, like in Littonsville, they were marketed to wealthier DC residents. And now they are the naturally existing occurring affordable housing. So there's a cycle, to affordability that is really important. So anyway, please continue.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I think new housing is almost always top of the market, and you'll see that kind of going down. And you can see that now as the the stock built in the 90s are now kind of becoming NOAA. What's happening is because of rent pressures, kind of all of the housing prices are going up. So that filtering effect is happening less than it would, say, 2 decades ago when the 60s units were becoming affordable.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide, please. So we did a little bit of projection, and as we kind of just discussed, there are fewer units, NOAA units built after the 1990s, just because of that, there hasn't been enough time for those to become NOAA yet, but they're already losing units at a faster rate. So whereas you would maybe with a little bit less rent pressure expect them to kind of become NOAA, there's still a forecasted loss of those units, and those units, even when you adjust for rents and everything and inflation and everything else, we see a loss of those units rather than those kind of becoming NOAA units over time. Next slide, please. And really, this is where the bulk of your NOAA is, built between the 60s and 70s. They're projected to be lost at a slower rate. So, there's an annual loss about, say, 1 to 2%. But really, because this is where most of your stock is, it's really important to kind of, even those smaller percentage shifts is going to account for a larger loss year on year. Next slide, please. And so based on these criteria, we kind of looked at every building, put them into these typologies based on, transit and the other 7 criteria that we looked at. And we're kind of seeing a loss between 7,000 to 11,000 units by 2030, based on a couple of different forecast models. Next slide, please. And again, putting every building into a specific bucket of what kind of what that typology is and what that estimated loss is, we're seeing most of that loss, or a plurality of that loss rather, being in the 1970s to 80s, 10 to 19 unit, that kind of middle typology, kind of lower density, but that's where a lot of that loss is. Post 2050 plus unit buildings, there might be a little bit of loss there. And then, going down to the between 60s and the older building stock, where there's going to be some loss there as well. I'm going to now turn it over to Mike, who's going to talk through our preservation framework and some recommended approaches.
Thanks, Arjun. And for the record, this is Mike Spots with Neighborhood Fundamentals. I'm going to spend a few moments discussing our proposed framework and recommendations, as Arjun just said. And the purpose of this overall framework is to help the county develop a strategy that matches the reason and risk of potential loss to the tools that are most appropriate in that given context. So referring back to a few slides ago, the core elements of a preservation framework is better understanding the types of properties that are there and the reason they might be lost, such as deterioration of the physical property, rent increases, value-add investment, and redevelopment. Now, if you're going to be successful in formally preserving a property, 2 primary conditions must be met in general. And the property must be in a sustainable financial position to ensure effective operations and adequate upkeep moving forward. And the second condition is that the property or affordable units therein must be protected from exposure to market pressures, that is, rent increases or redevelopment at an unaffordable price point. And this can be accomplished through a legal restriction, policy or loan agreement, or through transfer of ownership to a mission-driven entity. It's important to note that preservation is sometimes associated with preserving a specific unit, and that is often the case in intent and practice, and that is a perfectly viable approach and should be encouraged. However, it is also our approach to think about preserving affordability more broadly. And that can include preservation through a redevelopment effort that replaces the affordable units that were lost. So there is nothing stopping. So that gets to that core issue of understanding sort of why those units are projected to be lost from the stock. If there are just gradual rent increases and minimal risk of redevelopment moving forward, that lends itself to one set of tools. But if redevelopment is an option and it is an area that is prime for additional density, there are ways to preserve affordability without, even if you're not preserving the actual unit, and that may be more appropriate in the long term.
Thank you.
And
Just
next
want
slide,
to say, I think a lot of the impetus for this study came out of the work that the county did between planning and the council in some specific areas that we were rezoning in our master plans, like Long Branch, Littonsville, Bethesda, where we envisioned redevelopment that would have to meet kind of a no net loss, or at least a high threshold of preserving affordable housing, even if it wasn't necessarily preserving the exact units, although that was an option. And then that carried through to Littonsville, Veers Mill, where we enacted a no net loss vision in Veers Mill that is a combination of redeveloping existing properties through restrictions that allow for more density based on preserving the number of affordable units, as well as having the county partner with nonprofits to develop specific parcels and so on. So this study, I think, it's helpful, and it grows out of the work that we've been doing to support redevelopment that preserves affordable housing. So, all right, please continue.
Could we go to the next slide, please? So that brings us to the tools that can be utilized to preserve properties. And these tend to fall into 4 categories. Strategy and outreach refers to activities involved in developing an overall preservation approach and assembling and deploying a toolkit that includes coordinated and complementary interventions. Land use and planning refers to the tools that leverage the rules governing and guiding development, your comprehensive plan, zoning code, land use incentives, etc., to incentivize or require preservation and to facilitate the replacement of affordable units in the context of redevelopment, to the point that was just made. The tenants' rights category captures the rules that govern how owners, property managers, and developers act in the market. And the last and perhaps most obvious category is subsidy, which includes the capital resources to preserve via acquisition or operating subsidies or other forms of cost reductions to owners that incentivize them to keep rents lower than what the market otherwise commands. Next slide, please. So our report highlights a large number of recommended practices for consideration by the county, but there are several that are particularly important in the local context and with the context of the challenges brought on by COVID-19 and the associated economic disruptions. And as Philip mentioned at the top of the presentation, this was exciting because a lot of what we're talking about here are enhancements, improvements to existing tools and interventions that the county has already put into place in the past. And it's in many cases refinement or scaling up interventions to meet the need. There are some examples of new recommendations where we suggest new policies, but for the most part, we're talking about building on a pretty strong foundation that is already present in the county. So one of the first pieces that we want to recommend is in the category of strategy and outreach, and that includes stepping up with the coordination between DHCA, planning, and HOC and other mission-driven development partners to further enhance the effectiveness of the existing toolkit that has already been put into place. And there's some examples of this that has happened in the past, but to just provide just one sort of theoretical illustrative example, so an area planning effort for a neighborhood that includes important affordable properties can include a proactive effort to create or coordinate land use incentives such as bonus density that can be combined with DHCA financing tools to facilitate the preservation and or creation of a larger number of affordable units at lower direct costs to the county. So that is taking some of the case-by-case examples that have occurred in the past, building on the lessons of some of those efforts and expanding upon that with the greater coordination with the financing tools and systemizing, making that a systematic approach moving forward for all sort of area plans for which affordable housing preservation is a main goal. And coordination is a mechanism for triage is especially important given the enhanced preservation risk brought on by COVID-19. As NOAA properties in particular come under potential financial stress, that we've seen risk to especially these smaller mom and pop landlord properties across the country that may not be accessing some of these resources to keep them financially viable, there's likely to be more properties on the market, and that creates an opportunity. They can be preserved by mission-driven entities. However, we're also seeing signs that value add and other investors that are looking to max out market potential are seeing these same opportunities and will be competing for these same properties. So that's something to be keeping an eye on moving forward, that coordination between sort of the land use policy and incentives that can be combined with the financial tools, that now is the time to be thinking about that as these new preservation opportunities arise. Facilitating redevelopment opportunities and combining increased density with affordability requirements as we shift to the land use and planning category is critically important, because that serves sort of the two core goals that we're looking at here from a preservation approach. And first, by making equitable redevelopment financially feasible, the additional density offsetting the cost of the affordable units, it makes mission-oriented actors more competitive for some of these NOAA sites that may be coming on the market either because of COVID-19 disruptions or just would be coming on the market anyway. That with those affordability requirements in place, that kind of levels the playing field a little bit to a certain extent. And second, allowing often denser redevelopment in exchange for affordability can allow supply to better keep up with demand more broadly, creating those new units today that are relieving market pressures to a certain extent today, and create that future NOAA stock as those properties age and are no longer at the top of the market in terms of age, amenities, etc. And so our recommendations highlight a number of ways that equitable redevelopment could be accomplished, again, through some of the enhancement of existing tools, as well as looking at examining whether a preservation-oriented transfer of development rights program is feasible, and looking at the use of the MPDU program and some tweaks to those regulations to allow for strategic preservation of NOAA property as part of new development efforts. Moving on to the
So let's just bookmark those ideas and we'll come back to them, at a future time.
Sure. I can answer a quick question now too, if you have something that.
No, that's fine. I mean, I don't think we have time to talk about it. What a transfer of development rights for affordable housing idea might be. That seems intriguing, but I don't think we have time today to go in depth into much. We have a big item coming up at 10:30 today, okay. But I think we can, allow this report to kind of make its recommendations, and then we'll figure out what we want to come back to.
Sure, great. And I'm happy to answer questions at any point moving forward as well about our thoughts on that. With regards to tenant rights, we recommend considering the expansion of rent stabilization adopted after the COVID-19 crisis following the expiration of the relief bill. Even prior to the crisis, there were a number of rent stabilization efforts proposed or approved in jurisdictions across the country in response to rapidly increasing housing costs. We want to emphasize the critical importance of policy design. Rent stabilization needs to be designed carefully to ensure that there is still a healthy pipeline of new development along with preservation of affordability in the existing housing stock that supports residents at risk. It's critically important that you're not inhibiting new development, and believe based on the evidence, we believe that there are ways to structure rent stabilization policies that can accomplish that goal. And just a couple notes on policy design. Some of the critical elements to look at in order to achieve that are to consider the level of allowable rent increases. Modern policies that are newly adopted are more appropriately considered in some cases to be anti-gouging policies or rent smoothing policies, so that you're not getting those initial spikes or immediate spikes that can be really destabilizing to tenants. But that also account for market conditions and inflation and the like. There's also a critical policy design element is making exceptions for property improvements. So if a property owner is investing in the property, that there is a clear and non-bureaucratically debilitating way to improve your property and be able to capture the value of that investment. And then the third critical consideration for a rent stabilization policy is the types of buildings to which the policy applies. Does it apply to new development? Does it apply to just the older housing stock? There are a lot of different, and that's another probably larger discussion about the policy details, but there are ways to craft these policies that do not inhibit new construction. But that also makes monitoring and evaluation critical components of any effective rent stabilization effort, and making sure that you're understanding whether the policies are working and catching early if there are any unintended consequences. So
we could spend all day debating rent control. I'm very skeptical of what your comment there, that it can be done without suppressing investment in the market and drying up new production. As we saw, we rely upon new production of housing for most of our housing. So I think this will have to be a topic for another day. Others may wish to ask a question about it, but we're not here today to do a deep dive on rent control, and I'd like that we don't do that. So I see your recommendation. Let's keep going. Thanks.
In the category of capital financing, one of the most critical needs is to explore opportunities to expand the Housing Initiative Fund to meet the needs of the preservation pipeline, because it's important to note that in addition to the properties that are risk, you are financing new construction as well. You're also providing there's a need to provide periodic financing to properties that aren't at risk of loss, but are just aging. So those owned by your nonprofit partners that have no intent of taking it to market, but the property is getting 30, 40, 50 years old or needs to be refinanced. That still draws down money. And while because HIF loans are revolving, you get some money in, but there also is outlays. So there is a need for additional capital to meet the full preservation needs. But that's also why redevelopment and increased density and using land use tools is critically important, so that the Housing Initiative Fund isn't expected to absorb all of the demand for subsidy in order to effectively preserve housing units.
Thank you. And the cost of preserving a unit is much less than the cost of creating a new unit. And there's a lot of innovation happening in this sector right now. And this committee, we're working on new financing tools. And I'm expecting in January, the council will enact the preservation-focused funding targeting the Purple Line Corridor, transit-oriented corridors that we have developed at the committee, as well as we're also looking at pilot legislation to enable our nonprofit owners to move more nimbly in the market and purchase properties, and generally really assertively work on putting a larger share of the housing stock, especially in these corridors, under mission-oriented ownership. So I'm glad your report has highlighted those as well. Keep going, sorry.
Yeah, and that's, I actually think that's an important point, because it is more cost effective, generally speaking, all things considered, to preserve rather than have to replace through entirely separate new construction. But if you're preserving under mission-driven ownership now, you're preserving it at a lower cost now in many cases, while it's also a land banking opportunity for the future. So if, 10, 15, 20 years from now, if there's an opportunity to redevelopment leveraging external capital, such as the low-income housing tax credit, it's an opportunity to have a sort of a both-and situation. Preserve now, land bank for redevelopment in the future, with the land at sort of a captive mission-oriented cost today.
Yep.
And then I know we're running out of time, so I'll just close with addressing operating subsidy and cost reductions. We suggest expanding the utilization of rental agreements, which are already in use by the county, in which a property owner elects to limit rent in exchange for property tax flexibility or other forms of county subsidy. The county could also revisit past tax incentive programs that were designed to encourage rent reductions, to see if there are opportunities to revise and relaunch. There used to be a tax credit for smaller property owners who elected to offer lower rents to targeted households. From our study, it didn't seem like anyone ever claimed the credit. But it's an interesting idea, and we would suggest going back and looking at it to see why it wasn't utilized and didn't work, and if it could be relaunched. So that concludes my section of the presentation. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Okay, let's keep going. I think there's more presentation, right? Is there more?
No, I think this is the last slide for
Okay.
our presentation.
There's a lot more in the full report, but we try to give you all the condensed version. But
Gotcha.
back to comments that, you know, each of these tools in and of itself probably deserves its own full conversation, but we want to try to hit them at the high level, balancing nuance with brevity, which is always easy.
All right, I'd like to go back to Gwen or Casey if you have any summative comments you'd like to make.
I think that this study has reflected a number of interesting tools that we think deserve additional conversation. We have been, ever since the rental housing study, thinking about a few of these tools. When we updated the MPDU law, we looked at some ways to try to, consider whether we discussed whether preservation of affordable units could be tied in somehow with MPDUs. We found it a little too complicated at that time to add into the MPDU law, but we think that there are a number of ideas here that deserve further study. And, as we finish this and publish this study, we'd like to work with DHCA to consider which of them should be next steps in terms of implementation. Lisa or Casey, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
I'll just briefly mention that while the preservation study we presented today is draft form, and if you have any feedback, we'd certainly integrate it, but we are certainly taking the lessons learned from this study and implementing them in the Silver Spring Plan, which has, very recently there's been a lot of topic discussion about missing middle housing, but we know it's going to have a significant preservation focus. And so we're going to take lessons learned there and work with DHCA and how we can preserve a lot of those older properties in South Silver Spring, knowing that they appeared on this list of properties at risk of loss.
I just want to say a list of 9 properties, that's a list that the county can, I think, pretty easily handle. We got some time to do it. With working with HOC, working with our nonprofit partners, seems to me we ought to be able to work our way through that list one at a time. So that was the good news to me, was you've identified 9 properties that are deed restricted but privately owned. There's some risk that they could flip, but we've got first right of refusal. We can be an actor in that market. And if we have a strategy to make capital available, which we do, and we could do more, then that it might be something where we can actually really have an important influence.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to add is that I when we talked about this at the planning board, it became clear that there's a layer of this which I think this study could not really get to, which is what is the physical condition of individual buildings such that you could make a determination whether preservation or redevelopment is the best option, or in fact, whether redevelopment may be the only option. I've had some conversations with a couple of private, some nonprofit, some for-profit developers who have gone shopping for buildings that could be acquired with the idea of we want to renovate these using various sources of subsidy, put them into an income restricted program and use those subsidies to renovate the properties and maintain them as affordable units. And a couple of these folks have told me they've really struggled to find buildings where that makes any sense. That a number of the properties that sort of on their surface look like they would be good candidates for, sort of a renovation and then maintain them as basically in their existing form and then continue to rent them, basically in the way that they've been used for decades. It just doesn't work because the needs for upgrades to building systems or the physical condition of the building is such that really you need to just tear the whole thing down. And that's a critical issue. It's very hard to get out in a study like this. It's not realistic to be, I think, to be able to say we could look at the entire county and figure out what building is in which condition, but we have to try to figure out a way to differentiate, because, you know, property owners, a lot of them, when they want to redevelop, they'll say, oh, I have no choice. I have to redevelop. There's no way I can renovate this building. That may or may not be true. But I think the public sector needs to figure out a way to assess intelligently where there are properties that really cannot be renovated. It just doesn't make sense, because if we allow this idea of preservation to drive a lot of zoning decisions as part of master plans, we may inadvertently create a situation, and this has happened in other jurisdictions. I think in Arlington, there are some examples where the strategy was, well, we're not going to upzone this property because we want it to be preserved. And the result was a small multifamily building got tore down and replaced with market rate townhouses. So that's like worse than, you're actually worse than zero addition. You're actually reducing the number of housing units, and you've got new housing stock that's not affordable, it's market rate, and you've really just shot yourself in the foot. And in other cases that are less extreme, I think you could see a situation where, you know, you get a, you know, small, you know, garden apartment complex where you have to tear down a building, and what you get is basically the same number of units, or effectively the same thing as new construction, because you artificially limited the zoning envelope because you were hoping that you could preserve it as affordable. Just sometimes that works. I think that we had some cases like with Littonsville where, you know, some of those recommendations I think made a lot of sense to sort of split the baby and give property owners an incentive to redevelop part of the property if they would maintain some of it as, you know, affordable and renovated and operated under common management. That was like, I think that was really smart. But there are other cases, I think, where we sort of have kind of reflexively said, oh, we're not going to upzone this because that'll just encourage redevelopment. And in fact, some of these properties really should redevelop. In fact, they probably have no choice.
All right. Councilmember Jawando is up first, and then Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you. You know, I didn't know if we were going to hear from comments from DHCA, the housing entity.
Sure.
You know, I think it might be relevant to the conversation, but I want to allow.
Sure. We can hear some. Good idea.
Hello, everyone, again. This is Asim Nigam from DHCA. I mean, if you look at the study, it does a very good job in terms of doing inventory of different programs and what is out there, what may be at risk of, you know, being lost over the next 10 years or 20 years. And it clearly highlights the issues of bringing more capital into the HEF, or coming up with additional tools like the Opportunity Fund that we have been recommending to the PHED committee and to the council, you know, shortly, and then other tools that may be in the play, which may be helpful for our developers, whether it's nonprofit or for-profit developers. Because as you saw from the data, we have a lot of stock over here in the county which are owned by the for-profit entities. So somehow, you know, we need to keep our for-profit developers engaged as well, because in the end, you know, we have some very good for-profit developers in the county who are mission-oriented, like our nonprofit developers. So, but we need to create tools. So that's, you know, first and foremost, you know, post-pandemic situation over here. And then it also highlights things like, you know, land use recommendations. Some of it we already, as Councilor Reamer mentioned, you know, in Pierce Mill Corridor, Alpine Avenue property, and other properties that we are looking at. And then also talks about rent stabilization in some fashion for certain properties, which may have to be looked at, as Councilor Reamer said, a different day, but it basically highlights different strategies. So, you know, in a way, you know, this study really puts a very good inventory list of different programs and what may be at risk. It highlights things like, you know, net loss policy, which, you know, first and foremost among preservation of national affordable housing. Like, again, going back to Alpine Pierce Mill Corridor, where, you know, both the administration and the council are working together to make certain things happen. So our work is really cut out, but we have the opportunities as well. If the challenges, then challenges also provide opportunities. So we need to just seize the moment and take those challenges in the form of an opportunity and keep on moving forward. It clearly highlights the need of additional 20,000 households. It complements what COG and Urban Institute data showed us, and also complements what housing needs assessment showed us in terms of data. That we need to serve another 20,000 households at or below 50% of AMI in the next 10 years. Those are the COG goals. So besides the preservation of natural affordable housing at or below or exactly at 65% AMI, but then we need to bring those AMIs level down to 50%, 40%, 30%, where the actual need is. So our work collectively is cut out, and we need to just keep on looking at how we move forward in the preservation studies in the county.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Director Nagam. I just have a couple of questions. I know we don't have a ton of time, and this report is really helpful. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm wearing headphones today. Okay, good.
Yeah.
I'm just trying something new. So, I really appreciate the comprehensive nature of the report and the multiple strategies, because we know when we were talking about the COG housing goals, and what we need to do and the affordability we need, this has to be an all hands on deck approach, and we can't retreat to our normal battle lines of how do we get this done. And so I really appreciate the spirit in which the report does that. And I also, it was just on a personal note, it was kind of a reflection of my housing journey. I lived in Lenox Park, one of the 9 on the list. I also lived in Claridge House in Littonsville. I lived in Quebec Terrace, which is right on the Purple Line corridor, in one of the areas at highest risk for loss of natural occurring affordability. So I kind of like a little journey here down memory lane, but I appreciate the work. A couple questions for the consultant team. One of the things you said that was really interesting to me that I have struggled with and wanted to find more information about, and I'll probably be following up with you all offline just to give you a heads up. But you mentioned the discussion of replacing units, of how we replace. When one, you said new housing is always at top of market, and of course that's yes, right. We always see that. The thing that I've struggled with, and one of the things that your report suggests here, and I think one of you said it, I can't remember which one, is that one of the indicators of risk is the idea that incomes are rising. So I wanted to connect that conversation, because I have always felt, that while there's a supply-demand relationship, I have yet to see a community where supply has so gotten where it needs to be that demand for housing and the prices go down. Rather, I've seen market rate new housing always be market rate, and that it is modulated and released in a form or fashion to capture the rising incomes and the level of incomes who can afford that new market rate. So could someone speak to that relationship? It seems that you kind of did in some of the risk factors you identified. So Philip, I see you unmuting. Hopefully you understand my question.
I think I understand your question. I'm going to take a first stab at it, and then we have a whole team of people who think about this all the time. So if people disagree with me, they're going to jump in, I'm sure. So first, I hear a couple questions. One, in new development, unless it's subsidized, is top of market. That is generally what's going to happen. Now, talking market or submarket, the amount of supply, increasing the amount of supply can have some impact there, but really you're talking about a disinflation. So it going up at a slower rate, not it going down. So that's one part of that, why supply does matter. So it doesn't go up as much, but really where you're trying to get the benefit from on new supply is an origin flag, these building types. So you're your existing housing that should be filtering down, that is in fact filtering up. So it's the new units might still be luxury studio, $2,500. But if the building next to it doesn't go up at 5% a year because people are choosing to go to the new building, it's really the other building where you're trying to get the most impact. But I want to acknowledge, and we do a lot of work on supply, and we built some housing calculators that actually look at different policies and how it would shift markets. We did one for Portland and one for Seattle, one for Charlotte, North Carolina, one for Austin, Texas, where we look at like, if you increase production, how much would it cause rents to change? For the most part, it takes a lot. And so it's regional. Right. And two, you're not talking about so much a decrease as rents not going up faster than incomes. Like landlords are generally not cutting rents 10%. Now COVID's an exceptional circumstances, so you may see some of that, but generally it's more about, can we get rent growth for your older housing stock to get more in line?
Can you have the older housing stock rent growth to be more reasonable?
I think the supply side of affordable housing is really an underappreciated space, and partially the pushback is that sometimes it gets overpromised. It does not mean we're creating a bunch of affordable units, or that, although it could be, but generally it doesn't, or that rents are going to drop. It means we're moderating the growth to a level that incomes can keep up with, because that's the fundamental driver for households above 50% AMI. Now you have a different issue with households under 50% AMI that's more about income, and but I think the supply argument sometimes it gets shorter shrift than it deserves because that gets messed up. But so that's a very long and some hopefully somewhat clear. It can really make a difference, and we have really clear data that it can make a difference. But it doesn't solve your lowest income levels, and the newest units are always going to be
right.
You're always going to feel sticker shock when you look at those.
You need other strategies with it, along with it. It's
not one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Subsidies still got to be part of the game. Like, so the comment about a preservation fund where you're buying up properties, really what you're talking about in those situations, and we've worked on a couple of these models, is private equity. There's somebody's buying the property, and there's equity that's going into the property, and the equity has the highest profit motivation. So it's got the highest rate of return requirement. You can get your Fannie, Freddie, FHA debt. It's pretty cheap right now. Federal Reserve's really helping us on that front, but your equity still has a really high rate of return requirement. It's either a cash on cash, or they really have to pop up the value. If you can kick that equity out of the capital stack with public money or philanthropic money, you can really limit rent increase and preserve the affordability on properties, even push rents down. And there are lots and lots of these funds that people are trying and launching, and some of them work great. Some of them maybe are promising more than they can actually deliver, but it's the core idea is you're trying to kick the equity out of the capital stack, right? Because that's really what's squeezing this rent increase. And with that, just one other, I'm jumping all around, but there's so many good comments you all made. Mr. Anderson made a comment. I think one thing we've seen in other places is just understanding the property level economics. And sometimes you can't do it for every property, but what is the motivation from the owner's perspective? What is the financial motivation for them? Is it a redevelopment? What is actually going to be viable? Montgomery County has a lot of incentives, but understanding how those incentives fit together from the owner's perspective,
right,
I think is a really important piece of analysis, because owners are generally rational folks, and they're making a decision that, but they have a very different view of the world, because they're looking at their property and, okay, I can get this kind of debt and I need this kind of return. Understanding that is really, I think, important for making good policy.
That would seem to suggest that the blanket policy, like that the case by case sometimes can be helpful in the opportunity to have a negotiation or discussion. That's important.
Yes, and I'm gonna say no. Yes, because each situation is different. No, the challenge at the balance that is, owners generally don't like the government, and if they aren't clear about generally the parameters, like they need some clarity on what the parameters are.
You need a balance. Yeah.
You need a balance. You need some boundaries and negotiations within boundaries, which is easy to say and really hard to do in practice.
You're right. Well, I just said thank you. I have one other question. I think that was great for a holistic response to some of the comments. You mentioned in the bill, again, I know none of these we can go into. We just did a little bit on the financing and supply and the preservation fund, which I all think are all great ideas. The rent stabilization, you actually referenced my bill, the temporary rent stabilization, which I introduced and we passed. And I really appreciate your willingness to go there again as a tool in the toolkit, particularly in some of the areas that are hardest to maintain affordability. You mentioned near transit. That's obviously important for a whole ton of reasons: transit-oriented development, the environment, equitable, representative communities. And so I wanted to say on that if you have further examples of, then we can follow up with this later, you can mention it now, some of, you mentioned some of those controls, Mike, but I want to follow up on what the other types of design features that you have looked at in other places. You know, I just wanted to flag that. And you can comment on it briefly, but I just want to come back to it at some point.
Sure. So we've done some analysis on this in a couple different markets. We did some work most deeply in New York City as they were starting to change the regulation. You know, rent regulation does not have a good track record. I want to be clear on that. It doesn't have a great track record. That doesn't mean the tool on the whole can't be useful. And we're seeing a new era and new approach of tools and how rent regulation is done that are really more about moderating against, you know, price gouging. And I think that's important. We'll lay out, we're happy to share some. Part of it's about making sure that you actually set up the situation so the property can be maintained properly.
Yep. And
we're happy to share our analysis and previous work.
Great.
The other piece that's always going to be balanced, and it's hard for us as technocrats on this, is frankly the perception issue. The policy can be sound and it can do a good job of balancing, but so we work a lot for our National Multifamily Housing Conference, NMHC, which is a trade organization. They are reflexively in their bones, in their marrows, angrily opposed to rent regulation. If you say it, it's really hard to keep the conversation going. They just, and so I think part of it is about what good policy is, and part of it is how you're talking and engaging with your development and owners so that they hear your goal is not to destroy their business model. Because when they hear rent regulation at first, no matter what, they don't hear what the policy is. They just hear that this is an attack on their business model, and that's not that's not productive, but it's hard to get past.
And I appreciate you. I appreciate you raising that, because I do think that is, as with many things, it's one of the main challenges. You know, you can have the right policy, you can have the rationale on something, but just by putting it in this report, you're helping move the conversation forward, I think, in a productive way. So more to come soon on that and this whole set of issues. But I really appreciate the report and look forward to following up on several of the items. Thank you. Hey, Casey, it looks like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, we talked about this at some length at the planning board, and honestly, I'm very skeptical that you can have rent stabilization and not deter new supply. And I was assured multiple times by these guys, and I would like to just get that on the record, that the recommendation in this report is that we should not pursue rent stabilization policies that have the effect of deterring supply. And while I remain skeptical that such a thing is possible, our consultants assure me that it is. So I think that anybody reading this report should not come away with it from the idea that the recommendation is that the planning department or the planning department consultants are saying, let's do rent control. That's not what this says. It says we should think about how we can stabilize rents in ways that do not deter the new supply that we all agree, including our consultants, including the planning department, including the planning board, and I believe this council, that we need to avoid taking steps that regulate housing in such a way that you're going to discourage people from building new housing. Because even if you don't reduce rents, I think the jugular vein of that conversation you're having earlier is, it's true, you're not going to necessarily reduce rents, but constraining rent growth, moderating that rent growth, is critical to everybody who doesn't qualify for a subsidy, which is always going to be most people, because there's not enough gold in Fort Knox to subsidize our way out of this problem. We have to increase supply in order to keep housing supply within that the economic pressure on price from continuing to escalate for everybody. But I don't want to speak for them, but we had this conversation with the planning board, and I think it would be useful if we could get them to clarify this point.
Well,
Sure.
well, just before you respond, Philip, I think I read the report and I heard what was said today, and it seems like, again, going to my original comments, that there need to be a lot of options on the table. Obviously, the perception, the knee-jerk reaction Philip discussed, I think, we might be having a mini version of it here, but I think it needs.
Let's keep it mini though, because we gotta move on.
I agree. I'm just saying. I just think, and Philip can respond, but I just think we need to be careful with, again, this was very targeted. It's like within transit where the rents are most at pressure as a part of a larger effort, and I think that's a good thing to be talking about. So go ahead, Philip.
Sure. So first part. We did have a very productive conversation about this and supply. We've adjusted our plan. We want to make sure we're really clear on this. Supply has to be part of this solution. If you're not, fundamentally, if there's not an increase in supply, you're not going to get ahead of affordability because the market will overwhelm. We do think the newer forms of rent regulation are worth looking at, but recognize there isn't a great track record on them. And so it's about understanding what works and how it's worked and understanding probably. But we do think that we are recommending that's something worth thinking about, but recognizing that it can't stop production.
And there also isn't a good track record on maintaining affordable housing and people not getting gentrified and pushed out. So we
done this well. And
we got to have some different solutions. All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, I will refrain my best here from diving into some of the specific recommendations at the request of the chair and in the interest of time. But I do think there's obviously more conversation that needs to be had. I do think, and the challenge that I'm trying to grapple with this report and everything that I've heard today and what I read is that all of these things are related. And so there is a series of recommendations here, one that has an impact on the other, and they don't seem to flow together in a cohesive way. And I've yet to see from this recommendation or any as part of this report, what is the cohesive, thoughtful strategy that finds the right balance of the right puts and takes that actually moves us in the direction that we want. This, puts a bunch of things on the menu and says, do you want to eat this? And the flavors don't necessarily work together. And so, and some of the flavors overpower the others and could have a negative impact on what the intention of an individual policy recommendation. And so that lack of cohesion is troubling to me and is always a challenge in housing policy because we can only nurture nature. And the market is going to be the prominent driving force in anything that we do. We don't have enough tools in our toolkit, nor will we ever have enough tools in our toolkit to be able to overwhelm the power of a necessary housing need for a resident and the supply and demand between those in the marketplace and those who are producing it. So anyway, I just wanted to note that I'm a little frustrated by that. I'm not quite sure what to do with this except to say that there's a bunch of options that have been thrown out there and they all should be looked into and thoughtfully pursued, and I'll take that at face value. I think there's more time to do that, and we don't have enough time to do that today. Just a couple specific questions. When you talked about losing the naturally occurring affordable housing, the unit losses, was that netted out when there was redevelopment for income restricted units? It wasn't clear to me if that was a net of or if that was a total loss as you were looking at. So, for instance, if there's a 50 unit building, the 50 unit building, it was built 50, 60, 70 years ago, it's knocked down, it's replaced with a 1,000 unit building. The 1,000 unit building has to put in 150 units. Is that 50 or is that 200 loss of affordable units?
Yeah. So the NOAA units, the projections in and of itself are net. So it does look at that net number with anything that's been developed. What it doesn't look at though is kind of any deed restricted housing. So if at the same time as Ryan's analysis showed that there's an increase in deed restricted housing, that we've taken as a separate universe. So in the universe of unrestricted housing, it is a net number, but it doesn't include that deed restricted, subsidized LIHTC world at all.
Okay, so no deed restriction. Okay, I just want to understand when I look at that those units and what I'm actually looking at. Okay, and then I talk about the supply and the issue with supply. I think Councilmember Jawando's points about the supply issue, and I think you answered that reasonably well. That the issue isn't the new unit. The issue is the impact on the broader market. What we should be looking at, I think we spend way too much time, although it's important because these are where our main tools are, but it's on the brand new unit and it's on the restricted unit, through some form of policy or some subsidy or whatever the case may be. But what we really should be focused on is the actual market. In a normal operating condition, what does a 20 or 30-year-old unit that is desirable, meaning that it has been kept up and maintained, what does that rent for? And where does that fall into the income levels in that area? And, you know, and how cost burdened are those people to rent that unit? The challenge that we have is that we didn't build enough units, but, you know, between 1990 and today, or anywhere close. So we have 50, 60, 70-year-old buildings, some of which are being knocked down, some of which have been, you know, a ton of money has been dumped into, some of which have been let to go into disrepair. And then we have almost nothing from the last 30 years relative to the population growth that we have. That's what's creating the issue when we have 20-year-old units that are renting for extremely high levels. It's not the brand new luxury unit that is necessarily the issue. It's the older units that are renting at high levels, and that's what we need to figure out. And I think any strategy, to your point, that doesn't focus primarily on that, and then use the other tools to, you know, to nurture the nature of the marketplace, I think misses the broader issue related to housing. But you mentioned specifically in terms of the 60s, the 70s, and the potential losses there versus the 90s, and some kind of interesting aspects of the data. Is that based on the fact that the post 90s were built, you know, cheaper, you know, not built to last as long? Is that because the 60s and 70s were likely to have had major renovation, you know, or significant capital investment in those, or is it unable to be determined based on your data?
I think, and I'll let kind of Philip speak to this too. I think the major reason behind that is really because the amount of development that you saw in the 60s and 70s far outpaces, I think, to your point, the development in the 90s and the 2000s. So even relative shifts there far kind of are outsized in kind of the larger housing market. So just because there's so much stock there, that's what's kind of driving it.
So it's more a
in
sample
terms
size
of
peculiarity in the data than it is a function of what is actually happening with individual properties and individual property.
A small shift in the 60s and 70s matters a lot more because it's more of your NOAA stock. So you're having a bigger percentage-wise shift in your newer stuff, but it's just, as you were pointing out, not nearly as much was built then, so it matters less. I think that's part of what we're calling out there. The other point we're trying to make is, I think the comment was made earlier about the natural cycle of housing. Normally you'd see stuff as it started to get to 20 years really cycling down into NOAA, and we're not seeing that as much in your market. And I think that gets very much to your larger market comments, that there was not as much built as would normally be justified. And, you know, those are filtering up, not down. And those would be in direct competition with new development. So that, like, to the comment we were trying to make earlier about with supply, like, that's where the benefit of supply side is likely to show up the most, is can you create new units in geographic proximity that are competitive with those? And that will force a landlord to either moderate their rent increases or, you know, slight cuts, because, you know, new apartments are generally more desirable than older apartments. But we don't see that, we don't see it trending that way on average. Now there's certainly exceptions, but on the average, we don't see it trending that way.
I will also point out that the lack of supply benefits the property owners too, because they have to put almost no money into a property and they can get extremely high relative rents for older aging property because there's a lack of supply. So the idea that a strict preservation without the addition of supply somehow only supports renters and is at the detriment of property owners is not accurate. Because
that's part of the reason
the people who are doing the best here, the people who have held on to properties for 30, 40, 50 years, have put very little capital investment into making and maintaining those properties to keep them extremely nice, and are getting pretty close to top of market rent because there just aren't enough places for people to live.
And we see that when we look at the capitalization rates for purchases in your market. People are paying really low cap rates because there's an expectation that supply will stay constrained and that they will be able to set the market because there's very limited competition.
that is to me is like the screaming, flashing red light. And I think sometimes we distract ourselves from what the key problem is because our tools are limited there, but we do have tools, and I really do think we ought to focus on it. But I will yield the rest of my thoughts and comments. I appreciate those two clarifications and yield back.
Well, I probably should have booked a little more time for this discussion, but there's only so much time to be had. So any final comments? We have to move on. Thanks for the study. I do want to observe that we've seen rent gouging legislation out on the West Coast that limits increases, above 10%. I'm not aware of that kind of rent increase happening here. So I don't really see the value other than maybe political, to enacting that kind of legislation when we don't have that kind of market. And my general fear is that any action on rent control is just a chilling effect on the market. And you're going to drive out what little investment we get, which is not enough lately because we have weak job growth relative to what we need. And, we're just seeing that the producers of housing are not, they don't see this as a strong market to get into. And we have a lot of issues getting access to land. So I think it's a real issue for us, but I'm enthusiastic about the focus on preservation. Generally, I think there's a real, evolution in thinking, and the private sector is stepping up and the nonprofits are stepping up, and I think we can do a lot more. I'd like to, come back to those 9 properties that were mentioned as at the highest risk, and hear more from the county, from DHCA in the future about what their understanding is of that ownership and the conditions there, and kind of an outlook on those. And we'll be coming back to all these issues as we go. So thank you, appreciate the great work. And we'll move on to the next topic. Good to see you. Thank you very much. All right, continuing our focus on housing, we're now going to shift to a presentation from WMATA and a discussion about development at the metro station properties in the county. Hardly needs to be said, we've passed legislation that creates a very meaningful incentive. It solves a financial problem that makes metro property really difficult to develop. If Metro had a lot of money to put into its metro station site developments, then they would do that. But the jurisdiction partners are very clear that Metro needs to put its funding into trains and buses and rails, and so those properties just sit and they sit. So the council took strong action, and we created an incentive that gives us the ability to think, I think, in a much more visionary way about how to leverage the proximity of that land to the station. So we're going to hear a presentation from Nina Albert, Chief of Real Estate for WMATA, and we're going to do some creative thinking today about what the next steps are. Gene, is there anything you wanted to add to tee it up? No?
Nope. We're also joined by planning, I guess, is the only other, they'll participate in the conversation as well.
Yes, that's important. Planning is is part of this dialogue as well. So Nina, thank you for your great work. And I'm really excited about getting moving on what we've done and getting some great plans in place. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Councilmember Reamer, and everybody else on the FED committee for inviting me today. It was real. I hope that what I'm going to share with you today is just affirmation of how important legislation that supports TOD is needed. And I mean throughout this region. And I think that Prince George's County has really been a leader in, for example, rezoning and creating a TOD economic strategy that surrounds TOD. But this piece of legislation, in my opinion, is a leading piece of legislation and demonstration as to, the types of investment that are needed and incentive that's needed to really catalyze development. So anyway, thank you for that. And I think that you will start to see it. In fact, Fairfax County has already created a similar tax abatement, but not necessarily focused just on TOD. They've adopted this for the southern part of their county, and it does impact 2 metro stations. So this is something that this region is going to start looking at because it's such an important and powerful tool. May I just ask real quick, I know you guys are on a tight schedule. What do I need to do to get you back? I mean, how can is it do I have 10 minutes to have?
No, I think you should go through a presentation. I think, 20 minutes would be maybe a max.
Okay.
But we have a noon council session on state legislation.
Okay.
I'm sure we'd all like to get a quick breath before that, but
Okay.
noon is an absolute hard stop, but I'm hoping we'll wrap it up a little sooner so we can get.
Yeah, I'd love to be done before then, and try to.
I think we ought to be able to be done before then, but anyway.
Okay. And then I'm going to try and share my screen, Gene, and let me know when.
You should be able to do that.
Okay. Tell me if you can see it. Okay, great. And then can you see everybody's faces? Maybe I'll just minimize that. All righty. Okay, well, here we go. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but the system as we know it is continuing to expand. So in Alexandria, we're having a new Potomac Yard Metro station that's currently under construction. Obviously, the region is aware of 6 new Silver Line stations that will expand the metro system out to Dulles Airport, which is an incredibly important connection. And then lastly, the Purple Line, as all of you know very well, is a major initiative and project. And how it intersects with Metro is at 4 Metro stations. And in Montgomery County, those stations are Silver Spring and Bethesda. As is a topic of major conversation, these are just some numbers that were pulled and they're dated. So I don't want to rely on those as 2020 numbers. These are from about 2015. But if you take a look at the economic value and real estate value within a half mile of the metro station, you can see how important transit is to encouraging development and economic activity. In terms of property tax revenue, and this is on a regional basis, not in Montgomery County. I don't know if I could do that quickly. But it's so 4% of the land mass, which is the 4% within the half mile of metro, that's metro property, but mainly it's private property, is generating 28% of the land value in this region, which is pretty extraordinary. And then, this is up for, there's been debates around whether or not this is positive or negative. Typically, property values increasing is seen as positive just because it buoys the tax base. But, we're looking at 7 to 9%. And then this, again, is something that is really important. That proximity to transit is really important for job access. And so 54% of this region's jobs are accessible within that TOD zone. And it's important because for congestion reasons, people don't have to get in their car in order to get to their jobs. It's important for equity reasons, so that somebody, again, can forego a car and instead commute by transit, and not have that cost of a car and also to park. So for all those reasons, and convenience, that's really from an employer's perspective, what they're looking for is convenience and amenity, and transit offers that to them. From Metro's perspective, and this is a drum that I consistently beat because I think it's really, this is also an economic benefit to this region, which is if ridership can naturally return and also be very strong, then that allows Metro to be more financially self-reliant. And so these are numbers of, and it's comparing ridership, which is the blue line. I don't mean the Metro blue line, I mean the blue line on this graph. If you look system-wide at what ridership has been doing, and these are things that everybody knows, there's been a drop in transit ridership over time as teleworking, has become more widely adopted, particularly in this region by the GSA. And then we've been fighting very hard over the past 4 years to rebuild confidence in the system as it relates to safety and service reliability. And so you see a drop from 2015, which is when there was a very important and sad accident that occurred at L'Enfant Plaza, and the work that Metro has been putting in to rebuild that trust in the system. So the red line, by comparison, is ridership around Metro stations with significant development. So Noma, Columbia Heights, Silver Spring. You see a resiliency, and this is done on a percentage basis, so that you can see that on a resiliency, the uptake and the response of ridership around those stations with significant TOD, it never goes into the negative. It always stays positive, and it also returns at a much faster rate. Distance from transit is the single most important factor in customer retention, and that's why developing at the Metro station has such an important catalytic impact for us. Metro's been doing joint development for a really long time. And while I think that we're all very impatient for work to be done and for transit-oriented development to occur faster, just from a perspective, Metro has one of the nation's most active joint development projects. So we're an older system, and our first joint development was at Farragut North in 1975. And since then, we've done more than 30 projects of varying scales. So just taking a snapshot and really understanding what does joint development look like in in Montgomery County. This is just a snapshot. I'll run through these because I think you may have some questions before I go into sort of station specific, just looking at each station. So, I've put these priority numbers 1, 2, and 3, and this is really, the priority really reflects what we're going to focus to put out onto the market, sort of in tiers. So it doesn't reflect an actual date because I don't have actual dates. We have to respond to the market. So Shady Grove, we put in priority 3. It has a potential to be a very large project, $2.4 million square feet. I don't know what's wrong with me this morning. We've done a feasibility study. That's how we generated what the development potential would be. And it's mixed use, a mix of residential, commercial, retail. We think that Shady Grove could be a really special project because of the scale that it can achieve, and it can cater to a variety of different needs. And we would want to work with Montgomery County on really distilling down what the vision is for Shady Grove. Rockville, we've put as priority 2. And again, that's just, we would work on Rockville as the next tier after we get through priority 1. We have studied this already and believe that the development potential could be 826,000 square feet. Again, it could be a variety of different uses. To determine that, we are initiating a feasibility study this year with the city of Rockville to establish a vision for the Rockville Metro Station. And there's quite a few complexities at that station that need to be resolved. And so we're going to be working very closely with the city of Rockville on that this year. I've split Twinbrook up into 2 sides because in fact it is. The 2 sides of the Metro Station operate quite differently from one another. Tier 1 is where we place Twinbrook West, and we're interested in issuing a joint development solicitation, which most people refer to as an RFP, in calendar year 2021. And then Twinbrook East, we've done an initial feasibility study, but that I'll share with you why we have it in tier 2 in a moment. So White Flint also, I've distilled out and pulled out parcel H, which is already under contract actually with Elcor, meaning that they have an option to acquire that site. And their plans, especially now with the pilot legislation in place, they were working a plan, but with the pilot legislation are starting, they had shelved that plan, or they really weren't sure what to do with it because the financial feasibility of it wasn't there. But now with this pilot legislation, they're looking at a 340,000 square foot residential building. And then as a separate,
That's great news, Nina. So
it
Elcor has changed their development plan based on the availability of the pilot.
And I'll actually highlight what all three of our existing joint development partners are looking at right after this slide, so you can also get some visuals of that. At White Flint, we have approximately, and it depends on whether or not there's a user that would be interested in building over our tracks, but we have about 12 acres. If you were to include some of the air rights over the Metro train tracks, you could get up to 14 acres of developable land. So that's why you see this swing. That is our largest development project in Montgomery County. And we are still working on a feasibility study. And what I mean by that is really understanding what the real estate strategy is. But our intention is that within the next 12 months, we would want to get that joint development solicitation issued. And again, I'll go into more detail. Grosvenor, I think many of you are very aware of this. This is already under contract with 5 Squares. Bethesda, also, all of these are priority one, even the existing projects that we have, because they take a lot of work from our staff to respond to the developers' needs and plans. So Bethesda, we have had under contract since 2002, if I remember right. Actually, maybe even, well, anyway, there's 3 parcels. 2 of them have been built out. And then there's 1 parcel that has yet to be built out. And Brookfield Properties brought that to through a sector planning process and was interested in plans for a large residential project, 465,000 square feet, but again, wasn't able to move forward. And they are right now also very seriously looking at whether or not this pilot enables them to go ahead and move forward. Silver Spring is a complicated site because what was our joint development property, now with the purple line coming through, just from an engineering perspective, it becomes quite challenging. And so I've just said TBD for now because it requires further study. The contract that we did have, or that we were working on with Folger Pratt and with Urban Atlantic had expired. And so I don't have a developer in place right now. Forest Glen, we've put in tier 2 or priority 2. We've done a feasibility study. It's mainly residentially focused. With Wheaton, we are now this year studying Wheaton, and we're throwing into the mix and the scope of the study the existing Wheaton garage site. Because, and I don't think that, again, this would deliver right away. So, but there's so much development that is being planned around Wheaton that we thought it would be short-sighted to only look at our bus loop site and not also look at our existing garage site.
That's the garage in between the station and the mall.
That's correct. And Westfield has a really interesting redevelopment plan, and they actually own all of, or a lot of the property surrounding the garage on either side of the garage along Veers Mill Road. And again, I think it would be a shame. You could really reposition Veers Mill if you had a continuity of development all along Veers Mill, and in some way could consolidate the transit facilities. And I use parking. I throw parking into that conversation of what a transit facility is. We need, commuter parking. So we're looking at different schemes that would incorporate parking as part of the bus loop site, for example, or incorporating metro parking as part of the existing parking garage site, but allowing joint development to occur with that. So we're looking at all of those. And then Glenmont, we're putting in priority 3 because, again, that's a complicated, we have a couple different parcels and we don't know how they would knit together. And so that's subject of our FY22 feasibility study. So I'll just go through really quickly the sites that we have under contract and sort of what the status is based on what the developers have told us. So here's where I mentioned, 3 Bethesda Metro Station is an office building. And right in front, here's Wisconsin Avenue, just for orientation. It's on the right side of your screen, running north-south as it does. And then there's a big public plaza that you all are familiar with right along Wisconsin Avenue. The Brookfield in their planning process really seeks to keep that open as public space, but really soften it and redevelop it. And the main piece that many of you I know are aware of, but that is a huge opportunity for improvement, is this tiny blue square here, which right now is open from the ground level down into the bus loop. So there's a bus loop underneath. And by the way, this bus loop goes underneath this entire square. It goes underneath the new proposed building, and it actually connects underneath the Hyatt Regency. So what you don't see above grade is there's a common area that basically these ground leases are on air rights above the bus loop, in essence. That's how you can think about it. So it makes it very complicated to try and figure out Brookfield how to deliver this residential building on top of a bus loop, because the building itself needs many more structural and piers, foundation piers, than the bus loop allows. So if you can imagine the bus loop needing wide turning radiuses and all that's afforded if you were to build a normal residential building would be, enough turning radius for a car. So what Brookfield and what we've talked to them for more than a year about is, can you do spanning structural elements to keep that turning radius down at the bus loop level, while building a large residential building above. And that's always been the financial hurdle that Brookfield's needed to get over. And again, because of this pilot, and I just spoke with them last week, asked them where they were at, and they are very seriously trying to understand the pilot, understand, what they could or might not be able to move forward with. They have said they still think that it's going to be right on the margin, that the pilot may still not be enough, but that's what they're assessing right now. But it's pretty exciting if they could move forward. Yeah,
that's a signature site. That
it would be a tremendous transformation for the public space, for the metro bus loop underneath, and that's what this bottom image is, would be just a huge facelift, and it'd be a TOD that really truly integrates transit and development in a way that I think there are very few other development sites that would do that in this same way.
And I did want to just add, this is something that has been in our regulatory process for quite a while. It's gone through sketch plan, and the board has looked at it, has talked about the project extensively. So Brookfield has been moving forward as they continue to look at the financial side of it, at certain entitlements to move that project forward.
Yeah.
Great. Glad to hear that it might be possible to actually make it happen now that there's this pilot available.
Agreed. And then 5 Squares, I know that you're all very familiar with this site, but they have all the site-wide approvals. And again, they are very, very motivated to build high density. That has been their desire and plan all along. And then what is the investments that they are making, by the way, together with Metro, is finishing off the extension of the expansion of the existing garage so that all of that surface lot can become available for development in the future. And Five Squares is already investing upfront in the creation of public space and a public park. And to them, the reason that they're phasing the investment in this way, which frankly is quite anomalous. I mean, this is unique that this developer is this committed to delivering the public space first. They believe that it is part of offering that amenity so that others can have and see the vision that they have for a community that is arts and green space and transit oriented. So we know that it's transit oriented. It feels transit oriented because there's a lot of commuter parking. So what they need to do is integrate and show people how art and green space is really going to be at the heart of this community. And they, again, as you know, were sharing with you the information that they have on, you know, the only way they can deliver high rise is with this pilot. So again, this pilot already with the existing contracts that we have in place is causing people to move much more aggressively than they would have been able to otherwise. And then White Flint. So this is the White Flint site in the dotted white line. LCOR had interest in a joint development agreement for the entire site since 2007. So they have delivered quite a bit already. I do not want to suggest to people that something that, you know, White Flint is an open canvas. It has had development quite successfully, 1.64 million square feet, and you can see the projects that were delivered. And then LCOR has one remaining parcel, actually two remaining parcels that they could acquire. And the one in red here labeled H is the one that they have informed us that they want to exercise. They're interested in exercising their option on it, particularly now that the pilot is in place. And they have it's interesting, and these are some of the details that need to be worked out candidly. Their plan would be to do a portion of the site would be high rise and a portion of the site would be wood frame construction. And I will, you know, I think that I didn't go into great detail with them as to why it would be that way. But I don't know if it's just based on what the market can absorb or what. But anyway, that is what they're currently looking at, and delivery of 329 units. So that's pretty exciting. And then the discussion that I'll have in a minute here about the rest of the White Flint site, which is this big grassy open area, is what we'd be talking about prospectively for the future. But I did want to acknowledge what LCOR has already delivered to date.
Thank you.
Are there any questions on the projects that are sort of under contract now before I move on to what we're looking to put out in the future?
Well, I don't know that we want to get into today to what the county executive has been talking about with White Flint. I know there's a joint development agreement. That's a whole nother conversation.
Well, we can touch on it today, actually, but I think we should do it as part of the recap of White Flint.
Okay. In the next round.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't have any questions about what you've presented so far.
Okay.
Great.
All right. So this is the order that I'm going to go in, and it's really just taking the stations around the horn. It starts at Shady Grove and ends at Wheaton. So with Shady Grove, we have, again, two large parcels on either side of the metro station. This is an above grade metro tracks. We've taken some liberties because on the west side there's quite a bit of private development, and we've taken a look at how development on the west side of Shady Grove might spur, or how you might reorganize or deliver some of the private development adjacent to us. In all of these, you're going to see that we've tried to track what is being constructed by other developers within, a proximity to the metro station, just to get a sense of what's going on out there, that's not just metro development. So, and by the way, I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail at Shady Grove, and I will not repeat that for the other stations. The reason I'm doing it at Shady Grove is only to give you a sense of what Metro has to study in order to begin its joint development solicitation process. So this is the type of content that gets created or analyzed during what we call feasibility studies. We always look at our existing transit infrastructure. In this particular case, because we know what commuting patterns are, we look, in this case, we split it out between looking at the east side transit facilities and the west side transit facilities. Because this is an end-of-line station, there's a lot more parking than in other stations, and there tends to be a lot more parking demand. You can see here these little baby charts. These are just trying to give you a sense of what parking demand by parking lot is. And the reason we do that, again, is to try and figure out what are the replacement facility needs in the future. And we also take a look at bus routes. In this particular case, there's proposed BRT routes, and that can influence a whole variety of things, BRT, and so that's why we study that. And then we do a deep dive into parking because parking tends to be quite expensive to rebuild, and it's often a subject of a lot of public debate by the community who wants to make sure that there's enough parking at the metro station so it doesn't spill into the community if you're local, or if you're a park and ride user, you want to make sure that there's enough parking available for you. So we do a deep dive. Again, Shady Grove's a little unique, well, very unique because it's an end-of-line station. And so this top quadrant here, where it says park shed and proportion, you can see here that the greatest proportion of people who park at Shady Grove, 87% of our parkers there, come from a distance that is more than 2 miles. So they're commuting from wherever they're commuting from to Shady Grove as the first place that you can access Metro. So those end-of-line transit facilities and parking facilities become really important for us to capture as many car drivers as possible. As you get into into what we call the infill stations, right? The interior, away from the end of line stations, you see that proportion of vehicles being much, much different. So you'll see a lot more people coming from within a mile or two, and that's why they call it the last mile, driving to Metro. So on an interior station, if you want to discourage people from driving and instead you want them to do something else, bike, walk, maybe Uber, or maybe take the bus, any of those things, then you have to, create that last mile set of solution set. So anyway, so this is what we do. We do deep dive. We try and identify access patterns. Where are people coming from? Where are they originating from? What's traffic congestion? And how would that impact people's decisions? So anyway, we do all that. We also look at how do you increase utilization, for example. If there's an underutilized, let's go back here. So you can see here that on the west side, that's where there's a lot of parking utilization. But ironically, on the west side between 355 and the Metro is where you have greatest visibility. So you have greatest parking demand at Shady Grove on this surface parking lot, and that's the surface parking lot that has the greatest joint development readiness. And so it's a conflict. And so what we would want to do is strategically is try and move people to use the east side parking lots as much as possible. So going back here, how do we increase utilization and how do you move people and make it just as easy for them to park on the east side as on the west side? So there's direct access from Redland Road and improved signage. So these are the types of things then that we would need to partner with the county on to implement, because they're, again, off of metro property. So these are the ways that we in the jurisdictions work together. We also look at land use and take a look at what the zoning is, what the vision and sector plans are that the local jurisdictions have already put into place, and how they see the station. And then we also identify, what is the amendment process if we needed to, deliver, like what's the implementation strategy, and does the underlying zoning support it.
And I did want to just mention on that point, we are doing a minor master plan amendment for Shady Grove, which is going to be transmitted to the council probably by January. And we have been working with WMATA staff on some changes in zoning, particularly on the east side, to increase some of the densities to make that perhaps more attractive for a joint development that would add parking to free up the west side. So I do want to say we've been in conversation about that.
Yeah.
Great.
And by the way, we typically work most closely with the planning department, as does the developer, right? If it's just us and we don't have a developer, we'll work very closely with planning. We tend to work very closely with economic development, agencies. And then as the project advances and a developer is, moving into permits, we sometimes get involved at the permitting level, but really work very closely with planning throughout from inception. So we obviously, as we're doing a feasibility study, this is, by the way, I'm sorry if I'm just kind of going into all this detail. This is really just to give you a sense of what these feasibility studies do. So we take a look at real estate market conditions for office, residential, retail. We look throughout a mile around just to get to see what's naturally occurring without any activity from us, and what could occur if we were to develop. And so we identify what the constraints are, see if this is something that can be influenced or not influenced. And again, infrastructure is often a way to influence development in our case, because I think that real estate developers have a natural inclination and interest in redeveloping metro property. And we look at, supply and demand and all those kinds of things. So in this particular case here, you see that there is some projected unmet demand, right, for housing, which is great. And then with all of that, we then start to put together a development plan. Let me just say, the purpose of these plans are not for Metro to design the site. We, in fact, are not fantastic at that, right? The developer and their architects are really great at designing the site. The reason we do all of this is so that we can, what I call, right size the transit facilities, so that we can put them in the places and get concurrence from Metro staff, because we have to work with the operators, the rail, the bus, the access and Metro access, all of these different stakeholders within Metro that need to provide services. We use these feasibility studies as a way to have a conversation with them about, hey, can we reduce the number of bus bays, because we've seen bus service drop steadily. I'm using that as an example, and I don't know it. Yeah, that is actually true here. So we currently have 11 bus bays. This is top left, and we're proposing maintaining, but it could go as low as 9, but stay between 9 to 11. So these conversations and the split of layover, shuttle, etc., is all done internally. And then we produce these site plans because for example, if we're going to move parking around, or if we're going to move bus bays around, we need to do it in a way that allows us to continue to provide excellent operational access. And so this is so that the developer knows where they will need to deliver transit facilities for us and what land they have to work with that's left over. And so our plans are really just a snapshot. But they would then pick this up, work with us first to make sure that as they go through a minor master plan amendment, for example, and detailed site planning, they would be working then with you, knowing that they've satisfied the transit function. So these development programs are really, us working with our consultants to, kind of put a, thumb in the wind and say, okay, we think it can support this amount. This is not, we are not development experts. So we don't know if that's true. A developer would need to come and tell us and confirm that that's true. Or what they plan to build, right? If they are, an Edens, they might want to do more residential and retail. If they are Brookfield, they might have something more heavily weighted towards office. So that again is why, who we select and what they are promising to deliver becomes, part of the RFP process. And then lastly, again, and this is a very selfish, non-selfish way to look at it, we look at what the joint development's going to do for ridership. The development itself, because it's so proximate to transit, there's some predictable behavior of what a tenant, an office tenant, or what a residential tenant, how often they will use Metro. And so that's how there's a model that's publicly available. All of you could punch numbers in there and say, hey, if we develop this, how many riders would it produce? If you're within a quarter mile, it's much more sticky. People will ride transit a lot more than if you're within the half mile. And then we do not look beyond the half mile, by the way. Okay, so I will not do that same summation for any of these other ones. I'm just going to show you the end result. On Rockville's enormously complicated because we have such a huge presence of transit facilities, bus, kiss and ride. And then of course, the MARC station is not far, nor is Amtrak. So we're entering into a feasibility study with the city of Rockville to really envision how do we make improvements to the environment along Rockville Pike here, because this is clearly, the gateway to the county seat. And what purpose does this site on the west side of the track serve? On the east side of the track, you have single family homes here. And, how do you, again, create a place that makes sense for the neighboring community? So we've studied already, what the existing facilities are, just so that you're aware. The BRT is also interested in having a presence on site, and we've looked at different ways. And if the BRT were to do this right of way into the site, again, that would constrain the site along Rockville Pike a lot more. These are the things that we need to study in greater detail and work with Montgomery County DOT, as well as City of Rockville and others on the call here for exactly, what would we prioritize? How do we integrate it? What's the vision, et cetera? We've taken a look at, the land use, which has actually recently been looked at by the city of Rockville. And then of course, all these considerations of, heights, so that we're not imposing on the existing community. And I leave it at that because we're about to start with the city of Rockville this year on a visioning process and on developing some concepts.
Great.
Twin Brook, also two sides of the site. I had mentioned moving forward with Twin Brook West this in 2021 because there's a big Wegmans being planned here. And also because you can see how there's like a little piece that's kind of bitten out of what WMATA owns. We've never been able to develop this backside of this piece because there were no redevelopment plans from this private owner. The private owner has been talking to us about assembling just this back piece here with their property. And again, questions about this pilot would apply, and this is a unique situation. You're going to see all these little unique situations where only half the site would get the benefit of the pilot, but that might be enough, frankly, for this developer, hopefully, to deliver a higher density building, which is what the zoning and the land use plans call for. On the east side of the site, and by the way, a garage has already been built. So another reason I think we can move forward sooner rather than later with the west side is there will be very few replacement facilities on the west side. So that extraordinary cost of infrastructure on the west side doesn't exist. That is not true on the east side. On the east side, there are significant bus bays and significant parking. So that needs to be treated somewhat differently. So we've looked at it. Again, here we think that this parcel B might be an assemblage with this private property owner and offer, turn that into a development pad. And then we think that we can go ahead and offer parcel A also this coming calendar year, in large part because of the development and also the Wegmans development, and also because of the parking's already provided. We think that we will need to wait and see as to the east side of Twin Brook, and I'll get there. Okay, so White Flint, as I mentioned, if we were to include the air rights over the railroad tracks or the commuter tracks, we could have as much as 14 acres, but without it, you still have a very, very sizable site, 12 acres of greenfield to develop. So I just want to share with you that we've studied White Flint quite a bit, and we've come up with 3 generalized concepts because we think that White Flint has because it's such an important station with so much space, and really in an already sort of what is an urbanized environment. We need to keep working on streetscape and walkability and all those things, but the density and the mix of uses at White Flint is, the blueprint is set for it. So we looked at 3 different concepts because we wanted to have off the shelf, we learned from Amazon in going for that bid and offering our site to be part of Montgomery County's proposal package, is we wanted to have a few off the shelf options for White Flint so that we could respond very quickly if another Amazon style opportunity came about. So the first concept was, what if it was just to be more of an infill urban neighborhood, right? Which is what it's always thought about being in the past. So what does that look like? How do we reconceive what's remaining on site? The second option is really to target corporate campuses or institutional campuses. And the idea behind that is, again, we think our goal before we entered into an MOU with the county, our goal was to hold White Flint in the case that there was another Amazon style opportunity, but we wanted to have off the shelf. And then the third is, what if you created something really different, like something that had a little bit more movement, a little bit more uniqueness, like an entertainment or an innovation district, and we're not shaping it. We're not prescribing it. We were just trying to give some shape that was a little bit more dynamic in design feel. So here's, again, these are concepts that resulted from a feasibility study that we did for White Flint. We are agnostic to all 3. We just wanted them to be available. But here's if you did that urban infill neighborhood. And you can see here how we have built over the tracks. And this could be the last phase. We looked at this new metro station entrance that has been of interest for a while. So that could be delivered last, this corner of Rockville Pike and Old Georgetown Road. And then you could, when the market conditions were right, we're talking about 20 years from now, by the way, you could do an office that straddled the tracks. But logically, somebody would build along this east-west spine first and deliver and break down this, this super block into more urban-sized blocks, and create the street grid. So that's one option, and that delivers, 2 million square feet of mixed-use development. Here's option 2, which is, if we were to offer this in more of a corporate campus environment, how would you would still want a mix of residential. A lot of corporations are interested in residential, but preserve some open space. It's kind of like a quasi-urban suburban campus. So we did a concept around that, again, straddling the tracks here, building over the tops of the tracks. So this is a much higher density, 5 million square feet potentially. And then, we looked at something like a lot more dynamic, if you will, or unique. And so this was a concept around like a cultural center and entertainment center, right? So just to share a little bit, we have entered into an MOU with Montgomery County. The county executive's vision, and it's probably something like this. We haven't put form or shape to it, but is really to have a life sciences campus that harnesses the unique opportunity that Montgomery County is the fourth, well, it's not Montgomery County, it's the state of Maryland, is the fourth most active life sciences cluster or area in the whole nation. And my last slide on this packet sort of talks about this, and I'll go into more detail. And the county executive's vision is that White Flint really be, kind of a centerpiece in all of that. We know that there's a lot of industry activity along the 270 corridor. We want to bring that in closer and have a home and have a presence at White Flint as well. So it's complementary. So the role between the county and Metro is this. The county will take the lead in defining and assessing what the cluster industry is, what is the unique user or set of users, because it could be public, but it also should include a fair number of private users as well. And then the county's role is to establish the vision for this site. And, when it goes through planning, obviously it'll be handed over to planning. But, and the marketing to the life sciences industry. WMATA's role as the landowner is to put forth an RFP, to work with the developer, to coordinate with the county on all of the typical development activity that Metro normally undertakes. So that's how it's split out. And there's just going to be more information forthcoming. We're in the midst. WMATA is doing its real estate analysis right now on, how we would position the site and how we would offer it up. The county is doing their analysis on the cluster industries and what that approach is. So I would say in the spring, there'll be more to come. So I'll stop, Hans, because you sort of had some questions maybe, or others about White Flint in particular, or if you want me to keep going, I'll keep going.
I mean, I don't want to dwell too much on White Flint. It's one station among the 9, and I think the opportunity that we have with the incentive is really what we're focusing on today, and how to get into next steps and really deliver on the potential that the council created through the pilot. Obviously, anything that might happen at White Flint is going to be significantly benefited by the availability of the pilot. Whether there is any near to midterm reality to the executive's interest, I think is a question I'd love to explore at a future time. I think what we want to do now is just talk about how to move forward since the the pilot has been created. How do we move forward as entities working together and kind of operationalize some next steps? So I don't think we have time today to do even a shallow dive on any one, particularly on the executives, what he has discussed. But thank you for. I think it's notable that this is the first the council has heard about it. It's coming from WMATA. The executive branch has been, pretty. I wouldn't say secretive, but they haven't really shared much information. We tend to read about it in the press, and I think maybe in January, February, we ought to get a focused presentation from the executive branch as to what they're thinking. Meanwhile, I think we should really focus today more on the big picture of all the stations and the 2 corridors, east and west, together. Thank you.
Well, then moving on to Forest Glen. Again, we worked with the planning department as well as a fair number of community groups because there was an interest in what could happen at Forest Glen. How do we create and knit, more dynamic metro station? Now, we have kind of an unusual situation here in that we have a presence on 2 sides of Forest Glen Road The main side that everybody sees, of course, is where the existing parking area is and bus loop. But we also have this corner where the county already has in its CIP funding for a pedestrian tunnel that would connect the northeast corner of Georgia Avenue and Forest Glen Road to the southwest, west corner of the same intersection. And the notion behind that, just to remind everybody, is that right now pedestrians do not feel very safe crossing Georgia Avenue from these communities back here that are on the east side of Georgia Avenue. And in fact, we see that about 50%, remember how I showed you that park share chart up at Shady Grove earlier, and 87% of people are coming from beyond 2 miles. In this case at Forest Glen, about 50% of people that park at this metro station are coming from within a half-mile radius of the metro station. Wow. So why is it that so many people are driving to the metro station when conceivably they could walk, they could bike, they could take some other, they have an alternative choice to paying for parking. They have to pay for parking. They're choosing to pay for parking rather than use an alternative choice. And we believe, and we're not the only ones, I believe that others in the county,
intersection of that.
Yeah, is this intersection. So this is an important connection. And what it would allow us to do is if people really did start walking, is it would allow us to reduce the park and ride replacement count. Because right now it's at 95%. So anyway, this is, we've gone through this process with MNC PPC and Gwen's group. And basically it's, they're 2 very easy joint development pads that would be created from this surface parking lot. But depending again on when and how much needed to be replaced, we looked at different concepts of consolidating, the bus loop at the ground level and putting a garage on top of it. And again, depending on how much, and you can take advantage of the topography here to build that and then still have joint development above it. Again, the less parking there is that needs to be replaced, the more space for development that provides. And then the differences between these 2 concepts really are about the open space and where it goes. Do we keep it sort of right at, kind of closer to the community, if you will, and where most of the neighborhood is, and you still have room for a joint development, right along Forest Glen Road, or in the bottom scheme, do you have that open space right next to the metro station entrance, and have it have a different character? It would be more of a kind of a plaza and an open space, and you could see much more, in my opinion, I'm biased here, I think you can see much more dynamic retail right at the front door of the metro station if there's also open space where people can congregate and meet each other. But again, I think that in this particular case, I would like to see kind of how that pedestrian tunnel really impacts demand on parking, and then, work with the county on exploring last mile solutions.
All right.
Yeah,
if you can move really quickly through the rest.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I just want to offer this. So this has been something that, these are the last 2 slides that are really about thinking about, it's a new way of thinking about metro lines rather than being so station specific, which is how do we look at a corridor? Because in fact, between Bethesda to, let's say, Twinbrook, right? You can, on a single ride, a 10-minute ride, between Twinbrook and Bethesda, have access to all kinds of things. Strathmore, green space, office, jobs, housing, a whole variety of housing, and retail. I mean, it's a different way of thinking about how to position each station, and you would want to create a unique vision along a corridor and also market differentiation, because that at the end of the day is what draws people to go places. So this is something that actually 5 Squares shared with us, and it really prompted this much broader way of thinking about TOD. So they looked at it from a cultural and recreational perspective, right? Because they were really trying to define what Grosvenor Metro was going to be. So here you see all this green space. And so they're positioning their development as the arts, culture, and open green space metro. You know, the green line, what is it? The green stop on the red line. And from here, you can, within a 10-minute ride, get to the heart of Bethesda, you know, or go up to Twinbrook. I mean, it's quite extraordinary when you start to think about that. And Grosvenor then can become a feeder for residential to White Flint, you know, and people who are at White Flint, how easy is it to get onto the metro to come to Strathmore? I mean, all that way of thinking. So that was really interesting. And then when you layer on the economic development perspective and really catering to a life sciences industry, you could also offer a similar notion that, you know, here you have access to all these major institutions, which everybody already knows about. You guys all know about this. This is work that Jones Lang LaSalle is starting to do for us, which is, while White Flint might be one opportunity, there's actually other opportunities for life sciences as well, where we could position different metro stations to have a different character, so that as an industry, let's say a private company said, well, I'm really in this part of the maturity of, you know, the development of whatever my product is, and I want this, you know, this is the type of sub-community that really, you know, is attractive to my employee base. You know, Rockville has a very different feel to it than White Flint does, as Twinbrook does. You know, so, and as Shady Grove could be, whatever that could be defined as. So we're really interested at this moment in exploring. We don't have answers, but how do you think about either side of the red line as a corridor, and what are the amenities, housing, and jobs that people can get without going into the core of DC, but really kind of commuting up and down a corridor? And so that's kind of where we're at now, and we're thinking of like that along multiple corridors throughout the metro station. And I think that this is kind of a new way of thinking about it. It opens up and you know, many more opportunities for innovation. So
It's
with
a great
that, I
way
will
to
stop.
think about it. That's terrific. I mean, the idea of a corridor city that runs right up the metro line and Rockville Pike, that is the essential vision the county has for development. Yeah. But I think what you're offering here is a way to think about integrating metro more at the vision level and as a part of marketing strategy. And now that we have the incentive, the pilot, maybe we can actually make some of the numbers work to build it. You know, we've talked about this separately, but the east side of the red line is another opportunity, and the purple line is a third. You know, multiple corridor cities in the county that I think we would want to develop our own flavor and way of thinking about what each of those will be. You know, you've taken the opportunity here to kind of describe a vision for the whole red line corridor, which I really love. I think this is really smart thinking, and you know, the county is well known for having a suburban life sciences footprint, and increasingly they're saying the future is in a urbanized footprint as well. We want to have both. You know, we're not saying it's going to be one or the other. We just need to have the ability to offer anything. I wanted to, just before to make sure we don't lose it, we need a way to work together on what the public benefits and the infrastructure you know, goal is for each of these stations, so that as you proceed with RFPs, you're working from a foundation of general agreement with the county as to what it is that we're seeking and how that matches with, you know, what you need, and so that planning has the ability to kind of when something comes in, it's where we want it to be already. So you know, we've talked a bit about this, but I'd like to propose that we have planning and WMATA, and we may need to figure out whether there are additional players here, but work on a, for lack of a better word, like a functional master plan, but just a plan for each of the stations. We go through it together, figure out what the public goals are for each area, and then how we're going to achieve those. Because as you've said, there are, at each of these different stations, there's different ways and different opportunities to leverage the resources that have been made available. So we should have development over that metro station, the metro line at White Flint, bringing that development right up to the curb. I can't think of a few things that would be more important than that in the long-term future of making White Flint feel like an urbanized area. That's something we need to do. So we got to figure out how that works in the context of the pilot. And there's just a lot of different things for each of these stations that, I think we want to get clear on the front end. Like Gwen had mentioned this, but when we were talking about Silver Spring in the past, we had talked about in the Silver Spring placemaking master plan, having a building that might cantilever over the bus bays, the transit center. That might still be a possibility. So there's just a lot to work through. So as a follow-up to this, I'll ask planning and WMATA, at least the two entities, to work with me and work with us on a path forward, developing a kind of framework, and make sure that this whole important pilot that we created doesn't sit on the shelf, that this becomes a mission that we're trying to accomplish. So Gwen, can I just ask you to share some comments about how you think that might happen?
Yeah, I think that what's sort of exciting is we have a number of master plans going on right now that are focused on these geographies. The Shady Grove one I mentioned, Silver Spring has just begun. We also are doing a study called Advancing the Pike District, which relates a bit to some of the ideas for the WMATA site. It's broader than just the WMATA site, but it relates to that. I think what you're asking for is maybe a way to pull it all together. And honestly, one way to do that, although I need to, think about this a little bit more, is, we have the general plan coming forward. And perhaps there should be a section in the general plan that really talks about the unique character of each of the, stations. I mean, the general plan is talking about development along corridors, but this is a very specific corridor, the red line stations. And so that might be an opportunity to fairly quickly memorialize some of these ideas in a document, although we like the general plan to stay at a higher level, not necessarily get into a station by station discussion. I think we can definitely find some ways. I mean, I think Nina is great. We have a wonderful working relationship. We need to think about how to maybe work together to find a vehicle to memorialize these ideas and then start working on them one by one. I'm very excited about the Wheaton ideas, for example. And we've talked about those a lot. And I think there's a lot in our existing work program that could be used, I think, maybe to tie it together.
Why don't we look at that? Let's look at the work program, what's existing, what might need to be added. Can the general plan be used? What's the home for this? And are there resources that we need in order to bring it about? Okay, great. Let's go to Andrew.
Yeah, I appreciate this. Thank you for the presentation. I think there's a lot of exciting opportunities that are being pursued right now, which is really great. I will say the idea of a corridor is not unique to the region. I mean, the Ballston to Roslyn corridor is a thing. It didn't happen by chance. It happened by choice. And that was a planning decision that was made as part of a 12-year process, from my understanding, with a lot of stakeholder input to determine a significant emphasis on transit-oriented development at these strategic locations on top of Metro Rail. And each station was intended to have its own character. Roslyn was supposed to be the kind of the corporate business, type of site, corporate center, corporate headquarters. Courthouse was supposed to be the government focused center, the hub of local government. Clarendon was supposed to create a new urban village. Virginia Square was supposed to have a cultural and educational focus, and Ballston was supposed to create a new downtown. Whether those were the right decisions, the wrong decisions, there was an intentional decision that was made. There was planning done. I think we are way behind in this thought process, like 30 years behind in this thought process. I do think we have some strategic advantages and also some disadvantages. Our stations are farther apart, which makes it harder in parts of the corridor. We have NIH, which is a huge asset to the county for a number of reasons, but in terms of developing medical center as a site and having the walkability, that's a challenge because that is a very different characteristic type of station, and so it does create a bit of a hole there. But I do think we have to change the way that we view this. One, to think about corridors, which we have not done, ironically, since that is the whole premise behind our general plan, is the creation of corridors, but we've really focused on road corridors and not transit corridors. And number two, think about the unique nature of what each station could and should be. I think the idea of what 5 Square has talked about, to me, the less impactful aspect of that is the corridor concept. The more impactful concept there, to me, is the character of Grosvenor as different from every other site in the metro system, that it has more green space than any other site by a country mile. And that is a unique characteristic. There are natural aspects. It has a world-class arts institution on top of it. That is a unique aspect. So if you merge those two things together, you create a unique character. And so it's not just selling, hey, there's a metro station there, that's a good thing, we should attract folks to want to build at the metro site. It is, if you are looking for a specific thing, this is the thing that is being offered at this particular site. And now all of a sudden you've differentiated that site from the Northern Virginia sites, the Prince George's County sites, the DC sites, because we have something to offer that they don't. And you differentiate a Wheaton from a Grosvenor, for instance, and vice versa. And one isn't better than the other. The two are different, and they provide different opportunities for different types of investment and different types of focus. And I think we just need to do a much better, much more intentional job. So I just wanted to add that, to the element. One, corridors are not new. They're, quite old, in fact, and we are way behind on this, and we need to catch up in a big way. And number two, I don't want to lose sight of what I think is the most important aspect of this, is figuring out, what is the there at each of the sites? What is the unique opportunity at each of the sites? What do we envision them to be more specifically than we've talked about? It's not just about transit-oriented development, which is ubiquitous all across the country. There has to be something at each site that offers a different opportunity than everywhere else. And that's what I think is going to be transformational for this corridor and for the county.
Exactly. I think the RV corridor is a good analogy. That's what we want. That's what the White Flint plan was all about. 2010 White Flint plan, and great. Well, we have a set of next steps. Nina, thank you so much. Really pleased by your presentation. Really, so excited about what we can do here. So
yeah, this is just the beginning. Honestly,
this is
everything that we talked about, these corridors, the legislation will help draw interest. It already has. So now we've got to do the hard work of doing. So
it's a new beginning. It's a new beginning. Great. All right, we'll follow up on with Gwen and conversations about how we'll operationalize all of this. So thank you so much. And we are going to adjourn now so we can get 5 minutes break before state legislation starts.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.